Welcome back. There is a man sitting at a cafe table in Lisbon with a contract in front of him and a phone filling with missed calls he has no intention of answering. He looks completely at ease. That is where this story ends. You are watching his eternal diary. Let's go back to the dinner where it started. The restaurant smelled like beeswax candles, and the particular kind of expensive that uses understatement as its weapon. Low lighting, linen that had been pressed with something slightly floral. The kind of place where the waitstaff moved like they'd rehearsed it, and the ambient noise was calibrated so that conversations stayed private without anyone having to whisper. I had been to Thornfield twice before, once with a client, once for my firm's anniversary dinner, where I'd sat at the far end of the table and talked to the sommelier more than anyone else, because the sommelier, it turned out, had opinions worth hearing. I had booked this particular table 3 weeks in advance. I remember that clearly now. The 3 weeks. The call I made from my office, standing at the window, looking out at the city going about its afternoon, thinking that Isolde deserved a table by the window, and that the wine list at Thornfield had a Portuguese section I'd been meaning to explore. I remember the small, pleased feeling of having a plan come together before I'd even executed it. I arrived first, as I always did. She arrived 7 minutes late, which was also as she always did, and which I had always absorbed as part of who she was, rather than a small transmission about how she weighted her own time against mine. She was wearing the gray dress, not because it was significant, it just happened to be gray. She looked at the table when she sat down, not at me, at the table. "This is nice," she said. There was something in the way she said it that I filed and didn't examine. It sounded like someone complimenting a hotel room they'd already decided not to stay in. We ordered drinks. She asked for sparkling water in addition to the wine, which she didn't usually do. I noticed it. And said nothing because I was practiced by then at noticing things about Isolde and converting them into patience. 4 years had made me fluent in the art of that conversion. We had been together since the autumn of a year that felt, in retrospect, like it belonged to a different version of myself. I was 31. I had just left a large firm to build something of my own, an architectural consultancy that operated in the narrow but profitable space between heritage restoration and modern adaptive reuse. Old buildings repurposed for new life. I was good at it. I was also, at 31, the kind of good at it that still required me to prove myself every single morning, which meant I was often distracted, and often tired, and often more present in my work than I was anywhere else. Isolde was 29 when I met her. She worked in brand strategy for a consultancy called Wyndham Group. She was precise and articulate, and had an eye for what was wrong with a room that I respected professionally and found, personally, difficult to live beside. She had strong opinions about everything: presentation, timing, what counted as effort. I liked that about her for a long time. We were good in the early years. Good in the way that two competent people can build something workable when they're both invested in the architecture of it. We traveled. We had a circle of friends who liked us as a unit. We had inside references and a shorthand and an ease that I had confused with depth. I proposed 14 months before the dinner at Thornfield. I had thought about it for 8 months before that, not anxiously, methodically, the way I think about anything I want to do well. I considered the question from multiple angles. I considered whether what I felt for Isolde was the right material for a life, or whether it was the right material for what I had at 29, which was not the same thing. I came down on the side of yes. I chose the ring myself, not because she hadn't dropped hints. She had, and they were specific and brand-conscious, but because I wanted the choice to be mine. A narrow platinum band with a single stone, more architectural than romantic, which I thought suited her. Which, looking back, tells me something about how I saw her. She said yes, immediately, warmly. She cried a little, which surprised me because Isolde was not a person who cried easily, and when she did, it was usually about something abstract rather than something real. I remember thinking that the tears meant I had gotten it right. She put the ring on, and we ordered champagne, and I felt that night like a man who had made a correct and considered decision. I felt that for 11 months. The breadbasket arrived at our table, and I watched Isolde arrange her napkin with the focused attention of someone who had decided the napkin required all of her concentration. "How was the Aldercroft meeting?" she asked. "Productive. The clients signed off on the heritage facade plan. We start in the spring." "That's good." It was the third exchange of the evening, and all three had had that quality. Information passing between us with no heat, no interest, just the form of conversation without the content. I was aware of it. I had been aware of it for a while, actually. The preceding 3 months had had a specific temperature that I could only describe as managed. Like the heating in a building that keeps the space from getting cold but never makes it warm. I had attributed it to pressure. Her year had been difficult at Wyndham. A campaign had underperformed. There had been some restructuring. I had told myself that Isolde processed stress by contracting, by reducing the surface area of herself that was available to other people, and that this was temporary, and that my job was to hold the space steady until she came back to it. I had told myself that for 3 months. She reached into her bag. I was looking at the wine list when she did it. I had found the Portuguese section and was deciding between a Douro Red I knew and an Alentejo I didn't, and I had that small private pleasure of a decision that doesn't actually matter but feels like something. I was going to choose the Alentejo. I had already chosen the Alentejo in my mind before I looked up and saw what she had set on the tablecloth between us. The ring. My ring. The one I had chosen. The platinum band, the single stone, sitting on the white linen like something that had been handed in at lost property. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at her. "Callum," she said, "I've been thinking about this for a long time." Her voice was steady, prepared. She had rehearsed this, I understood. Maybe not in front of a mirror, but she had rehearsed the register of it. Measured, not unkind. The tone of someone delivering news that is painful but necessary, that she had taken seriously enough to present carefully, which in another context I would have respected. "I don't think I can do this," she said. "I don't think this is right for me." I looked at the ring. I looked at the candle behind it. I looked at the other tables where other people were eating and drinking and existing in their ordinary evenings, entirely unaware that something was ending 12 feet away from them. "For me," I said. "What?" "You said it isn't right for you." She paused. Something moved across her face that was not quite discomfort and not quite guilt, and was, I thought, the specific expression of a person whose exact word choice has been caught and who isn't sure whether to address it or move past it. "For us," she said. "I meant for us." I let that sit for a moment. The distinction mattered, but I wasn't going to argue about it at a restaurant table with 12-second-old information and the ring sitting between us like an accusation. "Okay," I said. She blinked. "Okay?" "I heard you. I'm not going to make a scene in a restaurant." The waiter appeared, with the exquisite timing of someone who had chosen the worst possible moment. He asked if we were ready to order. I told him we needed a few more minutes. He retreated. Isolde looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Part relief, part something that looked almost like disappointment. As if she had braced for a confrontation and found its absence disorienting. I picked up the ring. I turned it between my fingers once. Not sentimentally, more the way you check a component before you put it in your pocket. Then I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket and picked up the menu. "I'm going to have the lamb," I said. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in the 90 seconds after she put that ring on the table. It was not what people might expect. There was no collapse, no surge of hot feeling that I had to suppress. What happened was closer to a kind of very cold clarity. The sensation of a fog lifting to reveal a landscape that had been there the whole time, that I had been moving through without being able to see its actual shape. It was the sensation of something confirming itself. Because I had known. Not consciously, not in any way I could have named any point in the preceding months. But the body knows things the mind hasn't finished processing yet, and my body had been carrying something heavy for longer than I'd admitted to myself. The weight of noticing and not examining. The weight of patience converted from something it had no business being converted from. She returned the ring at dinner, and the first thing I felt, if I am being precise about it, was not hurt, but recognition. The second thing I felt, about 30 seconds later, was very quiet and very focused. It was the feeling I get at the beginning of a project when the scope becomes clear. When I know what I'm looking at, what needs to happen, and in what order. I have learned to trust that feeling. We ate dinner. I know that sounds strange. We sat in a restaurant where she had just returned my engagement ring, and we ate dinner, and spoke about things that were not what had just happened. She mentioned the food. I mentioned the wine, which I had ordered after all, the Alentejo, which was good. She asked about the Aldercroft project in more detail, and I answered in detail. And somewhere in the conversation she seemed to relax, fractionally, as if my composure had given her permission to stop bracing. Which was not, I should say, why I was composed. I was composed because I was already somewhere else, still at the table, still eating lamb with a sauce that was better than expected, but also in the part of my mind that does the actual work, already gone. I paid the bill. I paid the whole bill, which she didn't comment on one way or the other, which itself told me something. She said she'd get a cab. I said fine. We stood outside the restaurant for a moment in the October air, which smelled like car exhaust and the city preparing for winter. And she looked at me with an expression that was either regret or the face regret wears when it's waiting to see if it needs to show itself fully. "Callum," she said. "You should get your cab," I said. "It's cold." I walked to my car. I didn't look back. I drove home along the river, which took longer than the direct route, and which I had done deliberately because I needed the time and the movement and the specific quality of orange light on water at 10:30 at night. The city looked different from a car at that hour, smaller and larger at the same time, more indifferent, which was useful. I lived then, in a flat on the 4th floor of a building in a neighborhood that had been gentrified just enough to be pleasant and not so much that it had lost its texture. I had chosen it specifically because of the light in the south-facing rooms and the fact that the building's bones were Victorian and the previous owner had not interfered with them. I had lived there for 6 years. It smelled like my books and my coffee and the particular wooden floor that resonated slightly when you walked across it in the morning. I stood in the kitchen for a while when I got home. I made tea. I didn't drink. I looked at the ring, which I had placed on the kitchen counter. I looked at the flat, which was mine, had always been mine. Isolde had never moved in, which was a fact I had regarded as practical, and which I now regarded as information. In 4 years, she had never moved in. I had asked twice. She had cited her lease, her proximity to work, her need for her own space, which were all reasonable, and which I had accepted because accepting reasonable things was something I was good at. But 4 years is a long time to be engaged in the soft negotiation of whether to share a life, and I had been doing most of the negotiating and almost none of the arriving. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not because I was overcome, but because sometimes a hard surface is useful for thinking, and I began to take inventory. Inventory is a word I use deliberately, not memory, not reflection. Inventory, which implies purpose, which implies you are cataloging what you actually have, not what you thought you had. There was the trip to the Lake District 18 months ago, where she had been on her phone for most of the second day and had explained it as a client emergency, and where I had noticed and noted that when the call ended, she had closed the phone with a deliberateness that was slightly different from how she usually moved through the world. There was the night 6 months ago when I had arrived at her flat unexpectedly. Not dramatically, just I had been nearby after a meeting, and I had a bottle of wine, and I thought she'd be home. And she had answered the door with a tension in her face that resolved too quickly into welcome. I had stayed 2 hours. She had been fine, but the apartment had had a specific quality of recent tidying. I had noticed that too. There was Tobias. Tobias worked at a competing consultancy, Coldwater Partners, and had known Isolde from her previous role, before Wyndham. He appeared at social events periodically, twice at group dinners, once at a birthday party, once at an industry event where I had watched him talk to her from across a room for 20 minutes while I was in a different conversation and thought, he's telling her something she doesn't want other people to see her reaction to. I thought that clearly, in real time, and then I went and got a drink and came back and said nothing, because I had decided, as I often did with Isolde, that my reading of the situation was probably colored by something in me rather than something real. In retrospect, I was wrong about that last part. Tobias. I sat on my kitchen floor at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night and said the name out loud. Not angrily, the way you say the answer to a problem once you've finally worked it out. Then I stood up. I washed the mug I'd made tea in. I went to my study, which was the room in the flat that was most fully mine, drafting table, reference library, a computer that ran 3 monitors because I preferred to see multiple things simultaneously, and I sat down and opened a specific folder. The folder had been there for 18 months. I need to explain the folder. About a year and a half before that dinner at Thornfield, I'd been approached by a firm in Lisbon, a development group called Meridian, run by a man named Gideon, who had heard about my heritage restoration work through a mutual contact in Amsterdam. The Meridian Group owned 3 mid-century buildings in the Mouraria district of Lisbon that they wanted to adapt for boutique hotel use without compromising their UNESCO-adjacent designation. It was exactly the kind of project I was good at. I flew to Lisbon to meet Gideon. I walked the buildings. I spent 3 days in the city, which I had visited once before, but not properly. Not with the attention I was paying it that week, which was the attention of someone considering whether a place could be a home. I don't know when that shifted from professional consideration to something else. I know that by the end of those 3 days, I had agreed in principle to take the Meridian consultancy, and I had also walked along the river at sunrise on the last morning, thinking very clearly about what it would mean to live in a city where no one knew who I was in the context of someone else. I came home. I told Isolde about the project in general terms. Interesting commission, Lisbon. Will require some travel. She said that sounded exciting, and we moved on. I did not tell her about the folder. The folder contained the following: a company registration document for a firm I had incorporated in Portugal 18 months ago under the name Callum Voss Architecture LDA. The company had a Portuguese tax identification number, a registered address at a shared workspace in Mouraria, and a bank account at Caixa Geral de Depósitos, with a balance that had been growing steadily from a combination of the Meridian retainer and 3 smaller commissions I had taken in Lisbon over the preceding year. The folder also contained a lease agreement, a flat in Graça, the neighborhood east of Mouraria, with a view of the castle and a kitchen that had yellow tiles on the wall and a window that got the afternoon light. I had signed a 6-month lease 7 months ago. I had renewed it. I had been running a parallel professional life in Portugal for 18 months, not covertly exactly. I had not hidden the business trips. I had simply not explained them fully, and Isolde had not asked fully, and the gap between what I shared and what I did not share had grown into something significant, without anyone ever having to lie. I looked at the folder for a long time, and I thought, she gave me back the ring tonight, and the thing I feel most clearly is that I do not have to wait anymore. I had been waiting. I hadn't known I was waiting, or what I was waiting for, but I had been waiting. The Lisbon life had existed in a holding pattern, real enough to be an escape, not real enough to be the thing. And I had kept it at that level of real because I had not yet decided to take the step that would make it the thing instead. I understood now that the step had been taken for me, not by me, but it had been taken. I opened the Meridian folder and began to read the outstanding project notes I'd left 3 weeks ago, and the work came easily, the way it always does when something has been clarified that was previously obscuring the view. I did not call Isolde that night. I did not call her the next morning. She called me at 7:45 on Wednesday. I was already at my desk. I watched her name on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail, and I went back to the drawings I had been working on. She called again at 11. I let it go. There was a voicemail. I listened to it at lunchtime, standing in my kitchen eating a sandwich, the way you do when you want to consume information without giving it more than the space it deserves. Callum, it's me. I want to make sure you're okay. I know last night was... I didn't mean for it to happen that way. I'd like to talk, if you're willing. Just call me. There was something at the end of that message that I sat with for a moment. Not the words, the register. It was the register of someone who had expected a reaction and had received silence instead, and silence had introduced into them a slight vertigo. She had expected me to call. She had expected some version of a conversation, probably a difficult one, possibly a long one. She had not expected 7:45 and 11 and no response. I did not call her back. Instead, I called my solicitor, a man named Elliot, who had handled the incorporation of my firm 5 years ago, and who was, in the specific way of good solicitors, entirely unsurprised by anything. I need to talk to you about a few things, I said. Property, accounts, and what the process looks like if I move my primary residence abroad. When are you thinking? He said. 6 weeks, I said, maybe less. There was a pause. Come in Thursday. I'll be there. The following 6 weeks I will describe with the same precision I'd use to describe the critical phase of a building project, because that is how I experienced them. Not as grief, which they also were, but as execution. The emotional content ran alongside the logistical content the way two parallel walls run alongside each other. Structurally related, separately load-bearing. I went to see Elliot on Thursday. We spent 2 hours going through what I had. My flat was mine outright. I had bought it 6 years ago with savings and a loan I'd paid off early, because I dislike debt the way some people dislike clutter. Its value had increased considerably. Elliot advised that if I was relocating, the most efficient approach was not to sell immediately, but to put it under a management arrangement. A firm that would handle a lease and maintain the asset while I wasn't in the country. I would keep the income. I would keep the option to sell at a time of my choosing. Nothing would be liquidated under pressure. My British company, the architecture consultancy I'd built over 7 years, was also mine. No partners. I had had a partner in the early years, a man named Ferris, who had left the practice amicably when he moved north, and I had bought him out cleanly. I was the sole director and shareholder. The company's primary assets were its contracts, its client relationships, and its reputation. Two of my larger current projects were in their final phases and could be completed remotely with scheduled site visits. One new commission I was in early discussions for I could decline. The remaining smaller work I could wind down or refer. "You're not closing the company," Elliot said. "No. Dormant. Active, but no new UK work taken. All revenue redirected to the Portuguese entity." "Tax residency in Portugal when?" "I'll have been there more than 180 days within the calendar year if I leave by December." He made a note. He wasn't judging any of it. That was what I was paying him for. The Portuguese company, Callum Voss Architecture LDA, was already profitable. Meridian had signed the full project contract at a fee that was roughly 40% of my annual UK income on its own, and I had 3 other active clients. The Grassa flat was costing me less per month than my UK flat earned in rental income. Mathematically, the move did not require me to sacrifice anything except what I had already decided to leave. I left Elliot's office at 5:30. The street outside smelled like exhaust fumes and the bakery on the corner that produced something sweet and warm in the late afternoons. I stood on the pavement for a moment in the autumn light and felt the very particular sensation of a plan that has moved from concept to reality. The slight unreality of it, the slight relief. My phone had 3 missed calls from Isolde. I put it in my pocket and walked to the tube. I should say something about Tobias, because he became relevant in a specific way. 3 weeks after the dinner, I was at an industry event at the Aldgate Institute, the kind of event where everyone says they don't enjoy networking and then stays for 3 hours. I was there because a client had specifically asked me to come, and because I had decided that my life would not publicly contract in any way that could be read as collapse. I was there with the same professional composure I always brought. I had a drink, I talked to people I knew, I was fine. Tobias was there. He was at the other side of the room when I arrived, and I saw him before he saw me. He was with a group from Coldwater Partners, and he was standing with a particular kind of ease, the ease of a man who believes himself to be the relevant person in a situation. He was tall, good-looking in a blunt and unremarkable way, and wearing a suit that told you he'd thought about it. He saw me about 40 minutes into the evening. There was a moment, very brief, maybe 3 seconds, where something moved across his face. Not quite guilt, something more specific. The expression of a man who has done a thing and has since thought about it and has arrived at a position about it that he believes, on balance, protects him. Slightly raised chin, eyes that met mine a beat too deliberately. He walked over. "Callum, good to see you." "Tobias? How are things?" There is a version of this conversation where I ask him something, where I say something that makes clear I know what I know. I have seen that version play out in my mind, and I can tell you exactly how it goes. I say something pointed, he gets defensive or falsely casual. I feel nothing useful from it, and we spend the rest of the evening in the orbit of that exchange. "Things are good," I said. "Busy. Yourself?" Same. He waited a moment, as if the conversation might go further. I excused myself to speak to someone I'd seen arrive across the room. I didn't look back at him either. He called Isolde that night. I know this because she called me 20 minutes after the event ended, and when she spoke, there was a breathiness to her voice that told me she had recently received some information and had reacted to it. "I heard you were at the Aldgate thing tonight," she said. "I was?" "Tobias said..." "Isolde," I said. A pause. "I'm not angry with you," I said, which was true. "But I'm not available for this conversation." I ended the call. She called back twice. I didn't answer. She sent a message that said, "We need to talk. This isn't just about us. There are things you don't know." I read it. I set the phone down. I went back to the drawings I was working on, which were the facade restoration plans for the second of the 3 Muraria buildings, and I found a detail in the cornice work that I had been approaching incorrectly, and I worked on it until midnight, when I got it right. 2 weeks before I left, I began to tell people. Not everyone. I was selective about who got information and in what form, because the narrative of why I was going mattered for my professional reputation, and I had built that reputation carefully and intended to carry it intact. My 2 most significant UK clients were told in person. I had prepared the conversations. I explained that I was relocating to Lisbon for the foreseeable future, that my Portuguese practice was expanding significantly, that the projects I was currently managing would be completed to full specification on schedule, and that I was happy to make introductions to trusted colleagues for any future UK-based work they required. Both clients received this with equanimity, which told me that my professional standing did not depend on my physical presence in any city, which was what I had spent 6 years building it not to depend on. My close friends, the ones who were mine rather than mine and Isolde's, which own reflection was fewer people than I would have liked to count, I told in less structured terms. I said I was making a change. I was moving to Lisbon. No, not because of the engagement ending, though that had clarified things. Mostly because I had been building something there for a while, and this was the moment to make it the main thing. 2 of them understood immediately and without ceremony, which is the best kind of understanding. One of them, a man named Dmitri, who I had known since university, said, "You've been planning this." "Some of it," I said, "since before she gave back the ring." "Yes." He thought about that. "Were you happy before?" It was a question I had asked myself, and I had an answer to it that was honest. "I was functional," I said. "I was competent at the relationship. I don't know if that's the same thing." Dmitri made a sound that meant he understood more than he was going to say. "Send me the address," he said. "I want to visit." The night before I left, I walked the city. Not a sentimental walk, a practical one, because I have always thought better with my body moving, and there were things I wanted to think through before the morning. I walked from my flat through the streets I had walked for 6 years, past the bakery, past the library, past the building I had consulted on 3 years ago, whose new facade I could see from the main road, and which still satisfied me every time I looked at it. Past the restaurant where Isolde and I had our first proper date. Past the park where I had sat on a Sunday morning the day after I proposed, and felt, very briefly, like everything was in the right order. I walked for 2 hours. The city was dark and cold and ordinary, which was good. You need a city to be ordinary when you are leaving it. Otherwise, the leaving feels like more than it is. I had given away some things. Books I didn't want to carry, a lamp, kitchen equipment. I had packed, over the previous 2 weeks, with the efficiency I brought, to everything. What I needed, what I wanted, what could be acquired again if necessary. The flat was going under management on Friday. Elliot had everything he needed. My phone had 15 unanswered calls from Isolde distributed across the past 6 weeks. There were voicemails I had not listened to. There were text messages in a thread I had stopped opening. I was not blocking her, not yet, because I had no quarrel with her, in the active sense. What had happened between us had happened, and she had her reasons, and Tobias was welcome to whatever version of her he had been pursuing while I was treating her with the consideration she had not extended to me. I wished her nothing specific in either direction. But I had nothing to say to her. And I had learned, some years ago, that having nothing to say is a complete answer. It doesn't require elaboration. I went home. I checked the suitcases. I set the alarm for 5:30. I slept well. The flight to Lisbon was 2.5 hours. I had taken this flight so many times over the preceding 18 months that it had acquired the specific familiarity of something that is already home. The angle of descent over the Tagus, the warm quality of the light through the window even in November, the particular geography of the city visible from the air like a study in terracotta and geometry. I sat in the window seat. I had the drawings for the third Muraria building in my bag, and I looked at them for an hour without needing to because I had them memorized. But looking at them grounded me in what I was flying toward rather than what I was leaving behind. Gideon met me at arrivals, not because he needed to. I knew the city, I knew the route, I could have taken a cab, but because Gideon was the kind of person who marked transitions with presence, who understood that some arrivals are different from others, and that standing in an arrivals hall with a coffee and a handshake was a form of acknowledgement. He was 62 years old, Portuguese Angolan, with white hair and the calm of a man who has made and lost considerable money twice and found it instructive rather than devastating on both occasions. He had told me this on my first visit, matter-of-factly, over lunch, and I had thought, this is a person worth knowing. "Permanent now," he said, handing me the coffee. "Permanent," I said. He nodded, as if that were the only reasonable conclusion. "The third building meetings are Wednesday. The main clients are flying in from Munich." "I'll be ready," I said. "I know," he said. We drove into the city through the morning light. The flat in Grassa had a smell when I opened the door. Old wood and the particular mineral quality of Lisbon's stone, and something faintly floral that I eventually traced to a plant the previous tenant had left on the windowsill, which had survived against all probability. The yellow kitchen tiles caught the mid-morning light and turned the room a color that was almost amber. I put my bags down. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Not with the feeling I had stood in my London kitchen 5 weeks ago. Not that cold clarity. Not that inventory feeling. Something different. Quieter. A settling. I made coffee. I found the drawing materials I had left on my previous visit still arranged on the desk in the smaller room I used as a study. I sat down. I opened the third Muraria building file, and I began to work. The work was good. The work was immediately good, in the way that work is when you are doing it in the right place with the right amount of your attention, when nothing is pulling at the corners of your focus. I was in the building fully. I was in its bones, its problems, the specific challenge of its south-facing light well that needed to be opened up without compromising the classified facade, which required a particular kind of lateral thinking that I had been approaching from one angle for months, and which I now, sitting in the amber kitchen light of a flat in Grassa, saw from a different angle entirely. I found the solution by early afternoon. I made lunch. I went for a walk in the neighborhood, which had its own particular texture. The handmade tile facades, the steep streets, the cats, the washing lines, the smell of bread and coffee, and something always faintly of the sea, even though the sea was not close. I walked for 40 minutes. I bought wine from a place near the Miradouro, where the owner recognized me from my previous visits and asked, in Portuguese I had been studying deliberately for 18 months, whether I was in town long this time. "Permanente," I said. He looked pleased. He wrapped the bottle in paper and said something about my Portuguese having improved. It had. I had been working on it the way I work on anything I decide to learn. Systematically, without embarrassment about the early stages, with the patience required by anything worth doing. I walked back to the flat with the wine under my arm and the afternoon light doing something extraordinary to the castle walls to the west. And I thought about nothing specific and everything vaguely, and felt the exact quality of being where you are supposed to be, which is a feeling I had not felt in a long time. My phone had one new message from his old. It said, I know you're not reading these. I just need you to know I'm sorry. I was confused. I made a mistake. I'd like the chance to explain. I read it in the stairwell of my building, the wine under my arm, the afternoon light coming through the small window on the landing. I put the phone in my pocket. I carried the wine upstairs. I poured a glass. I went back to the drawing table. The months that followed had the quality of a life being built rather than recovered. I want to be clear about that distinction. There are stories of this shape that are organized around recovery, around the healing of a wound, the slow restoration of a person who has been unmade by someone else. That is not what this was. The ring coming back across that tablecloth had been painful in the way that seeing something clearly is sometimes painful. The pain of recognition, not the pain of loss. What I was building in Lisbon was not what I had been before, repaired. It was something different, that I could only build because the particular constraints of the previous structure had been removed. I worked with a focus and a quality of attention that I had not had in 3 years, possibly more. The Meridian Project, the 3 Muraria buildings, was the anchor. I gave it everything I had. The first building opened to its pilot tenants in March. It was, objectively, good. The heritage designation was preserved, and the interiors achieved what we had aimed for: contemporary function without the erasure of history. There is a specific quality in a building that has been treated with intelligence and respect. You can feel it when you walk through the rooms. The materials speak to each other across the decades. The light falls the way it was meant to fall. Gideon brought the Munich clients to see the first building on a Thursday afternoon. They walked through without speaking for 20 minutes. Then the senior partner, a woman named Elena, who ran a hospitality group with considerable standards and very specific aesthetic requirements, said, "When can you start the second one?" "It's already started," I said. "I've been on it since January." Elena looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at me with a particular expression I had come to recognize, which was the expression of a man whose confidence in you has just been publicly validated. The second building was contracted at a fee that was, by that point, more than my entire previous year's UK revenue. I hired someone, a young Portuguese architect named Inez, who had trained in Porto and had the specific combination of precision and flexibility that good restoration work requires. She worked from the Muraria office, which was no longer a shared workspace, but a studio of my own that I had taken a 5-year lease on in February. I had a business, a real one, a growing one, in a city where I was known for the work itself rather than for the context of someone else. I kept my Portuguese study methodical. By spring, I was conversational. By summer, I was fluent in professional contexts. By autumn, I could argue about structural engineering specifications with a Portuguese contractor and win, which is the most practical definition of fluency. Dimitri visited in April. He stayed a week. On the second evening, we sat on the terrace of a restaurant in Alfama with a view of the river and the April light doing what April light does in Lisbon, which is something it has no business doing as consistently. And Dimitri said, "You look different." "How?" "Less managed. You always looked like you were managing something." I thought about that. "I was," I said. "Was it her? Or was it the whole thing?" "I think the whole thing. She was part of the whole thing." He nodded. He was good at that, at receiving an honest answer without making it a bigger moment than it needed to be. "Are you—" he started. "I'm well," I said. "Not performing. Genuinely." "Good," he said. "That's good." We drank the wine. The river was gold in the evening light. Somewhere below us, in one of the streets that ran down to the waterfront, someone was playing something on a guitar that I didn't recognize, but that suited the moment exactly. Isolde's calls came in waves. There were 11 in the first 3 weeks after I left. I answered none of them. There were voicemails, I know this because the notification count accumulated, which I did not listen to. There were text messages, which I did not open, though the previews that appeared on my lock screen gave me their general shape: apology, explanation, request, confusion, apology again. I had made a decision, very deliberately, about how I would handle contact from her. I had not blocked her number. I had blocked her email. I had blocked her on every social platform, not angrily, but because those were ambient information sources, and I had no need of ambient information about Isolde. But I had left the phone line open. I had left it open because I wanted the ability to know she was calling without having to respond. Because the calling itself told me things I found useful to know, not for any harmful reason, but in the way that data is always useful. The frequency, the timing, the duration of the gaps. You can read a person's state of mind from how they try to reach you when you will not be reached. In the first month, the calls were dense, 2 or 3 a week. Then there was a gap of 3 weeks in December, which I read as her having decided that silence meant acceptance and that she would stop. Then a single call on Christmas Eve, which I read as the holidays reintroducing the question she had been trying to stop asking. Then nothing until the 3rd week of January. January brought a concentrated cluster of 5 calls in 8 days. The messages in that cluster were longer. I knew this from the voicemail duration indicators. Whatever she was saying had expanded. I read one of the text messages from that period because it appeared at a length that exceeded the preview, and I found myself curious about the shape of it. It said, "I know you're somewhere you're happy. I've heard that you're in Lisbon. I know about the firm there. I want you to know that what you had, what you built, I always knew you were going to do something like this. I just didn't know it would be without me. I was scared of how much you were. I want to explain that. I want you to let me." I read it standing in the doorway of the Muraria office, morning coffee in hand, the old street below me beginning its day. I thought about that message for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I thought, she was scared of how much you were. She is explaining her behavior by reference to my qualities. That is not an apology. That is a reframing. And Isolde, who had worked in brand strategy for a decade, knew very well the difference between a reframing and an accounting. I put the phone away and went inside to meet Inez, who had a question about the load calculations on the second building's mezzanine installation. We solved it in 40 minutes. There is a version of this story where I describe the specific mechanics of the asset and professional transition in less detail. And if you are reading for the emotional narrative, you might prefer that version. But I think the practical specifics are worth having, because the specifics are where the actual story lives. Here is what I had done, concretely, in the 18 months before that dinner. The Portuguese company, Callum Voss Architecture LDA, had been incorporated correctly and fully with all required Portuguese regulatory registrations for an architecture practice. This had cost me €1,100 in legal fees and approximately 40 hours of my own time, spread over several months. It was fully legal in both jurisdictions. I was paying tax in Portugal on Portuguese income. The UK company was paying tax in the UK on UK income. The transition of tax residency had been handled by both Elliot and a Portuguese fiscal advisor named Rui, who were in communication with each other and had managed the timeline so that I did not pay double tax on the overlap period. The Graça flat lease was in my name. The Muraria studio lease was in the company's name. Both were renewable. Both gave me genuine security of tenure. The rental income from my London flat, managed by the property company Elliot had engaged, was paid monthly into a UK account, which then transferred monthly to Portugal. After tax, it covered the Graça rent with approximately €300 remaining. I was, in that sense, being paid to live in a city I had chosen. My professional reputation in Portugal had been established through work, not through networking or introductions or any mechanism that could be unwound by someone else. The Meridian buildings were the work. Elena's Munich group becoming a client was the work. Ines, who was now doing preliminary consultations on a commission in Porto, was the work, extending its own reach. None of this had required a savior. None of it had happened by accident. It had happened because 18 months ago, I had sat in a borrowed meeting room in Moravia with Gideon and looked at 3 buildings that needed someone who could see both what they were and what they could be. And I had been that person. I had been building this before she gave back the ring. The ring had simply removed the last reason to wait. In April of the following year, 14 months after the dinner at Thornfield, Gideon told me over lunch that Elena's group had shortlisted me for a larger commission, a heritage adaptive reuse project in Oporto. 4 buildings in the old mercantile district, a commission that would have been, 2 years ago, beyond the realistic ambition of my practice. "They like the Muraria work," Gideon said. "It's good work," I said. "It is. They also like that you don't perform. Elena spent a lot of time with architects who perform the work rather than doing it. She notices the difference." I thought about that. About what it means to perform a thing versus do it. About 4 years of performing a relationship with a competence that had been real, but had perhaps been a performance of competence rather than the substance of actual compatibility. "How long for the Porto submission?" I asked. 6 weeks. She wants a preliminary approach in 3. "I'll have it in 2. Gideon smiled, which was the most economical form his approval ever took. The last call came in May. I know it was the last one, not because of any dramatic declaration, but because of its quality. There had been 11 calls in the preceding month. A new concentration, which I read as something having changed in her situation. The messages in that period had shifted in tone, less apologetic, more desperate in the specific way of someone who has realized that the ground has permanently shifted, and that what they have been trying to reach is not temporarily unavailable, but genuinely somewhere else. The last call came on a Tuesday at 6 in the evening, Lisbon time. I was at the outdoor cafe table I used most evenings, a place on the Rua do Salvador with chairs facing west and the specific quality of late afternoon light I had come to organize my days around. I had the Porto preliminary drawings in front of me. I had a coffee that had gone cold because I was working. I watched the screen. Her name illuminated for 25 seconds, the duration of the ring. Then, missed call. No voicemail this time. I looked at the screen for a moment after it went dark. I thought about the woman I had known for 4 years. The competence of her. The precision. The way she had stood outside Thornfield in the October air with an expression that wanted to be regret and hadn't quite managed it. I thought about Tobias and his slightly raised chin and the suit he'd chosen to tell me something he didn't have the clarity to say directly. I thought, there is nothing here I am still in debt to. Not as a feeling of triumph, more as a statement of fact, the way you make a final note on a building project when the last snag is resolved. It's done. The work is done. I put my phone face down on the table. I picked up my pen. I went back to the Porto drawings, which were asking a specific question about the structural integration of a glass atrium into a 19th century mercantile facade. A question that was interesting, that was worth my full attention, that had a right answer I hadn't found yet. I found it 40 minutes later. The light had gone amber by then, the way it does in Lisbon in May, the way it makes the old stone walls look like they are lit from inside. Like the city has a temperature of its own that is not the sun's temperature, but the city's. I sat with that light for a few minutes and did nothing, which is something I had learned to do in Portugal that I had never properly learned in London. Elena's group had, that morning, confirmed the Porto shortlist had been reduced to 2 firms. Inez had sent a preliminary report on a commission inquiry from a heritage trust in the Algarve. Rui had confirmed that the second-year tax declaration in Portugal was straightforward and that my residency was fully established in all relevant documentation. The Graça flat had been given 2 more years of lease. I picked up the drawings. I rolled them carefully, the way you roll something you don't want to damage. I settled the bill, which was €3.50 for the coffee, and left the change on the saucer. I walked back through the streets I now knew as well as I had ever known any streets, past the tile-faced building on the corner, past the tabacaria, past the old woman who sat outside her door on fine evenings and who had, over 14 months, progressed from treating me as a tourist to treating me as a neighbor, which is the most precise measure of belonging I know. I climbed the stairs to the flat. I unlocked the door. The yellow tiles caught the last of the evening light and held it the way they always did. I put the drawings on the desk. I made dinner. I ate it at the small table by the window, with the castle visible to the west, lit against the darkening sky. A structure that had been standing for 9 centuries on the strength of its own design. My phone stayed face down on the counter all evening. I didn't turn it over.